Okay, excellent. Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining for this webinar. As you've just heard, we are recording this webinar, so you can watch it again later or share it with anyone else you want to share it with. Um, sorry, just going through some admin first. So yeah, you can view this recording at the end of it, share it with other people, and you can also watch all previous webinar recordings on our YouTube channel. I can provide a link in the chat later if you're not sure where that is. And yeah, so we have Ben. Ben's an interdisciplinary scientist who's interrogated the links between biodiversity and people using seagrass meadows as a model social-ecological system. His research is broad, including applications of local knowledge to conserve and manage seagrass-associated recreational fisheries in the tropical Atlantic, understanding how ecology, poverty, and food insecurity drives seagrass fisheries across the Indo-Pacific, and exploring the social ecological science needed to restore seagrass meadows in Northern Europe. Please leave your questions for Ben in the chat throughout the webinar if you feel like it, or you can ask him questions at the end. Yeah, so everyone, please join me in welcoming Ben. Off to you, Ben.
Thanks, Yume. Thanks. So I wanted to start this with an image that many of us are used to. A seagrass meadow carpeting the seafloor, and like many of us, it's captivated my interest for the better part of 14 years. So before I start, I kind of really wanted to take you to where this journey into seagrass fisheries began. And back in 2013, 2014, I just finished a master's thesis focusing on seagrass meadows in the UK. It was very ecological, looking at how leaves and cover are influenced by water quality. And when I passed my viva, I flew to the tropics in pretty much the exact same day. And we're going to go next. Yeah. I flew to the Wakatobi archipelago in Indonesia. And when I got to Indonesia, I experienced a very different type of seagrass meadow than I was used to in the UK. One where humans were an integral part of that system. One where people actually lived on top of seagrass meadows. And since that trip, my passion, my love for seagrass has really evolved to incorporate that connection that people have with seagrass. And I usually say that it's only when I put my head above water that I truly understood the importance of these habitats. So the last 10 years of research with myself and a few others have really been about telling this story of seagrass fisheries. And that's what I'm going to discuss today, how these seagrass fisheries evolved, why they endure, and why they are too important to ignore. And the story of seagrass fisheries, I think, really starts with the migrations of humans out of Africa. And it's well accepted that over a period of 150 to 200,000 years, modern humans migrated out of Africa, firstly dispersing north into the Arabian Peninsula, east across South Asia, and then across Southeast Asia and the Coral Triangle. And obviously there were much more recent dispersals over land to the north, but the earliest modern humans, unequivocally they coasted out of Africa. And around this time, our oceans were very different. Sea level and ocean temperatures were lower. The continental shelf, particularly across what is now the tropics, would have been characteristically subtropical. So intertidal seagrass meadows were abundant. And some authors suggest that the green line you see on this map is the route that humans took to migrate. And obviously, what we know about this region now is that these coastlines are fringed with dense and abundant seagrass meadows. So it's inherently likely that as humans were migrating, they would have encountered seagrass across their journey. and as hunter-gatherers, most likely collected resources from those seagrass meadows. And we know from cave paintings that early humans swam, and there's even some records from Europe dating back, roughly 120,000 years that have linked Neanderthals to seagrass via the fossil remains of invertebrates. Unfortunately, though, our fossil record is pretty sparse. The archaeological record is sparse, and those probably dense shell middens that were left as a result of the collection of all those invertebrates and fish remains, they probably remain buried underneath what is now seagrass. And in terms of fisheries, seagrass only pops up again around 10,000 years ago. Yet, even if the archaeological evidence is sparse, we've been left pointers that give us a glimpse into those ancient seagrass fisheries. So, for example, in Qatar, lines in the sand that are visible from satellite imagery reveal a network of tens of kilometers of stone fish traps that are placed across seagrass meadows and designed to trap fish as that tide retreats across them. And these potentially date back around 6,000 years and link to rich rabbitfish and snapper fisheries that supported Eastern Arabian Neolithic communities. And we know that from the fish remains that have been found in some of these archaeological sites. So, interestingly, I think wherever we look at these historic depictions of different human cultures and societies in coastal regions that were or still are abundant in seagrass, we see people fishing from or in the coastal zone. We see people fishing in what are likely seagrass meadows, whether these are Native Americans in the Chesapeake or the Lucayans fishing for parrotfish and conch in the Bahamas. So there's no question about it, really. Seagrass has shaped coastal fishing communities for millennia. Whether we've just misunderstood that and often forgotten about it, that seems like it's the reality. Now, when you encounter a relatively pristine meadow, or at least one with limited fishing pressure, I'm not sure pristine is the correct word to use, you start to realize why these environments were and are still favorable fishing habitats. It's pretty simple. The abundance of fish is high. These meadows are relatively shallow. So even with basic and traditional gears like spears, traps, or small cast nets, you could expect a pretty good harvest. Yeah, we know that seagrass meadows provide habitat for fish, but often we tend to value seagrass meadows not just for fisheries, for other ecosystem services too, by grouping all of the seagrass species into this much broader functional entity, this seagrass meadow. And we know that not all seagrass meadows are created equal. Not all seagrass species are created equal in the terms of what they provide in those ecosystem services. And obviously this overlooks the fact that seagrass meadows are structured by co-occurring species. Some of these, they range in their structural and functional characteristics. Some are really short, some are tall and thick, forming these really dense canopies. So there's this really large variability. So the question really is it the diversity of species that's important for fish? Or are meadows dominated by these small ones or these large ones? Or is it this combination of species that's really driving those fish communities? And across numerous studies from a range of different locations with differing seagrass species, we see the same sort of pattern. It's not the number of different species that matters. It's instead, as seagrass complexity and cover increases, the more fish you get. For abundance, I think structure, at least from the host of literature that's out there, structure is the most important driver. Things like high number of leaves per shoot, taller canopies that are really driven by just a few dominant species. And for fish richness, seagrass cover tends to be the most important driver. So the higher the cover you get, the more dense those seagrass canopies, the greater number of species you find. And these results, these findings, they highlight then that it's certain seagrass properties that are important for fisheries by affecting fish abundance and diversity. Now, moving to the now, the presence of those fish abundant seagrass habitats across our coastal seas has allowed those seagrass-associated fisheries to proliferate across the globe. So much so that we find evidence of seagrass fishing in 90% of the countries with known seagrass meadows. So generally, wherever we find seagrass, we also find people fishing in it, either for food security, for livelihoods, or even for recreation. And what we're talking about here is not just single or small groups of individuals that are using seagrass. Some of these are really thriving, economically significant industries. And seldom talked about in the seagrass conservation agenda is the role of seagrass in supporting recreational fisheries and the potential for conservation action and finance from such recreational fisheries. And many of these are non-extractive, they're catch and release, and they target a host of different species across the globe. So the value in these seagrass recreational fisheries is really the habitat themselves, and that habitat being functional and resilient. And these have immense values that are often left out of discussions on the ecosystem services of seagrass, but they're actually really, really important. Take, for example, the case of King George whiting in Australia, a species that's highly dependent on seagrass for its juvenile phase and through sub-adult phases. And in just one bay in Southeast Australia, seagrass has an estimated economic value of 34 million Australian dollars per year, just in terms of providing fish biomass that supports thousands of recreational fishing trips per year. And that equates to 1% of the total economic value of Australian fisheries and aquaculture sector. 1%. And that's just for one large bay and one species. So that's before we account for any other of the numerous benefits of seagrass, or before we extrapolate to that to other bays where this species is present and utilized as a recreational or even a commercial fishery. Likewise, seagrass meadows in just the Florida Keys support a recreational fishery that contributes roughly $500 million to the US economy per year. And that's more than the total GDP of some small island developing states. And in Belize, seagrass-associated recreational fisheries are worth around $50 million, so 2% of the country's GDP. And in the Bahamas, that value is $170 million per year, so 1.7% of the country's GDP. So we're not just talking, as I said, we're not just talking about small individuals. These are thriving economic industries supported by seagrass. And what's really unique, I think, about some of these fisheries is that stakeholders actively want more protection from things like boating impacts. And in the Florida Keys, using co-production, recreational fishers themselves have called for twice as much seagrass to be protected from damaging leisure boat activity than the Florida Keys Marine Sanctuary had suggested in their management plan. So this is a very unique case where fishers are actively asking for more protection. So these stakeholders, they're not to be ignored, and we should use their stories and experiences to advocate for conservation. But this is seagrass fisheries. It's really a tale of multiple different types of fisheries. Some that are at polar ends of the economic spectrum. It's a story of sometimes very unique and culturally important fisheries that seemingly go unnoticed. Take, for example, the 400-strong Bedouin fisherwoman supported by seagrass in what's called Habut Hashish, or the Bay of Grass in Oman. And these women, they meander through seagrass meadows at low tide, gleaning the environment for invertebrates. Take, for example, the Monken sea nomads of the Meek archipelago in Myanmar, here using barrier nets placed across seagrass meadows to capture pretty much everything, but primarily turtles, which hold a deep cultural significance to them. All these unique and incredible shrimp fisheries in Sri Lanka, where shrimp are so abundant within seagrass that they can actually be caught by hand and placed into plastic bottles. But the question here really is, what is it that's drawing these groups, these individuals to seagrass? What is it that drives these fisheries, particularly across the Indo-Pacific, where we see these types of fisheries massively proliferating? And to answer that, we need to understand those communities. We actually need to talk to those communities, those fishing communities that are actively engaged with those resources. So over a period of 10 years, we interviewed over close to 1,000 fishing households across Tanzania, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Indonesia. And 50% of those fishing households, 50% of the people we spoke to, said that they preferred fishing in seagrass, mainly because they were reliable. They preferred fishing in seagrass over other habitats like reefs, mangroves, mud, rock, and offshore. Households said that you could always expect a big catch, that there were lots of fish and invertebrates there, that fish was an easy place to go to, and you could always catch lots of fish. There was messages and quotes about seagrass their nets not getting snagged on seagrass like it does on reefs. And seagrass meadows are this bank in the water. And despite these large narratives around coral reef fisheries that have really prevailed within the literature and even within policy across the Indo-Pacific region, it seems then that seagrass meadows are actually the preferred habitat. And alongside this, we also tried to understand what drives a household to be dependent, to use seagrass meadows for food or livelihoods. With a host of other habitats that are available, are there household characteristics that can be used to sort of predict whether or not they use seagrass or not? So using structural equation modeling, we looked at whether certain things like income, alternative livelihoods, the number of adults and children in a household, or ownership of certain fishing gears and motorboats, whether those sorts of characteristics influenced seagrass use at that household level. And this, I mean, this really reveals something that's super interesting, in that we found this dual effect of household income that was mediated really by ownership of different fishing assets. So the wealthier a household, the more likely they were to own motorboats and certain types of fishing gears. And we found that those with motorboats, those with access to boats that could go elsewhere, they fished elsewhere. They could afford to travel further, and they could fish on reefs, and they could fish offshore. But households without motorboats, they were far more likely to be using seagrass. They were dependent on seagrass. So poorer households, they were more dependent on seagrass for its proximity, that easy access resource. Then the other hand, here we see that wealthier households also had available capital to invest in certain types of fishing gears. Things like static fish fences, which, depending on their scale, they can be used to catch fish like they are across Indonesia, or invertebrates like shrimp, where they're used in Sri Lanka. And those that owned such gear, they were sort of restricted to seagrass, basically due to the high rewards and those low effort requirements. They were reinforced to use that because they could catch fish all the time, and they didn't actually have to invest much at all after that initial investment in the gear type. So what we see is this sort of duality. You know, the poorer households, they're depending on seagrass as a safety net, that easy access food. It's the only habitat that they can reach. It's the only habitat that they can target. And the wealthier households, they depend on seagrass for high rewards and high returns. So, you invest in that gear early on, and you will always catch fish. But this concept of seagrass meadows as a safety net caught our attention, and it's been something that we've been discussing for quite some time now. So we wanted to do some further digging into this, and basically try and see if there were any general patterns associated with poverty, or at least one measure of poverty and household wealth. And to do this, we upped our ante, we upped the sampling. So we almost doubled the number of households that we spoke to. We spoke to 1,705 rural households across 156 coastal fishing communities across Cambodia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania, and also included new sites in Indonesia and sites in the Philippines. Now, this data set, this represents the largest data set ever collected associated to seagrass fisheries in the region. And it includes a selection of countries that have, a range of economic and environmental characteristics that allow us to make broader generalizations about the region. So, seagrass fisheries in Tanzania, they're not dissimilar to those in Mozambique or Madagascar, despite the differences in GDP. They operate in many of the same ways. So with this information, we can start to make some broad assumptions about the role of seagrass fisheries across the Indo-Pacific as a whole. And using multi-model averaging and a series of 10 different household level predictors, some of the same ones we used before, but some other ones that were slightly different. We found that household income, our measure of poverty across the Indo-Pacific, that is strongly influenced by livelihood strategy and reliance on seagrass meadows. So across hundreds of different statistical models, these were the two predictors that came across time and time again as being really significant in driving those differences that we see in household wealth. And fundamentally here, seagrass dependent households, so and those that are using fishing as a income generating activity, they were significantly poorer than those with diversified income sources. And for seagrass dependence, we saw that pattern emerge across all countries, regardless of the individual country's respective GDP. So fishing households that are often the poorest of the poor, living below country-specific poverty thresholds, they depend on seagrass. The data is clear that this is what we're seeing across a host of different countries. When you're poor and you're in a fishing community, seagrass is where you turn. To make this point clearer, we used a model to predict probabilities of seagrass dependence based on our measure of poverty, so international dollars per day. And if you're not aware, international dollars per day it's a term used in economics to it's a way to account for the differences in purchasing power across different countries. So basically, it means that one international dollar, no matter where you are, no matter what country you're in, it has that same value. And then controlling for any differences between countries, what we reveal is that households in extreme poverty were more likely to be entirely dependent on seagrass meadows. And what this means on average is that with every increase in $1 per day, the likelihood of depending on seagrass and fishing in other habitats, it decreases by roughly 4%. So as fishing households get wealthier, as households are moving out of poverty, they diversify their fisheries. So what this is telling us really is that seagrass meadows are lifelines for those in poverty. They're habitats to catch fish and invertebrates, some that are eaten, some that are sold to purchase rice or other household items that are vital for survival. And I think that the reality is that when we lose seagrass, people starve. I mean, we see these images of famine-struck sub-Saharan Africa, but the reality here is these communities that are living below those poverty thresholds, they are experiencing the same trials and tribulations that we're raising billions and billions for in other regions of the world. Using that information, we then extrapolated this out and estimate that seagrass meadows currently prevent 7.3 million people from rural coastal fishing communities from falling further into extreme poverty across those 5 study countries. So that's 7.3 million people they're at risk if seagrass loss continues. And this is just the people that live below those international, extreme poverty thresholds of $2 and a bit per day. 7.3 million people that are below that. Moving towards more realistic lines of like $10 per day, that number, it gets considerably higher. And this obviously isn't an estimate of the amount of people that are using the seagrass meadows across these countries. These are just the people in extreme poverty that are depending on seagrass. 7.3 million people that are at risk. And when you take the cost of, or at least the monetary cost of alleviating poverty, which is roughly $180 per person per year, that equates to 1.3 billion alone in terms of a poverty alleviation value. Not a small number, and again, this is just those 5 countries. And those previous maps I've shown that show how abundant seagrass fisheries are across this region and across the globe. That number is probably significantly higher if we were to do the same sorts of studies and really try to extrapolate out those numbers. But yeah, 1.3 billion in terms of poverty alleviation value, ecosystem service value that it never really gets mentioned, particularly in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this really is why these fisheries endure. They're reliable. They're culturally important. They've supported humans for millennia. They're habitats that people turn to in times of need, but they're also habitats that people turn to for sport and for recreation. And I think the challenge really is recognizing that, particularly at a time where these habitats are gaining recognition for blue carbon, and at a time where governments are pledging and committing to fully protecting the ocean from fishing and banning fishing activity. And I think, in the context of equitability, just transitions, particularly for these incredible social ecological systems, it's vital that those 7.3 million people, just in those countries alone, and the millions of others that are using seagrass across other countries, they're not left behind in those conversations. And as a community that is, aiming towards seagrass net gain and conserving global seagrass meadows, I think it's our duty to uphold the value of seagrass in this sort of policy arena where wealthy countries want to buy carbon credits in other countries for protecting seagrass at the expense of these people, at the expense of the people that need them most. It's vital that we don't forget the reasons why seagrass meadows are so important for people. And to wrap up here, I think it's really important to remember that most of the world seagrass meadows are still vulnerable. We see hotspots of vulnerability across many of these locations where seagrass fisheries are so important. And many of these vulnerable sites, they're already within MPAs. So across the seagrass bioregions, 50% of human impacted sites are within MPAs. And particularly across the Indo-Pacific, we're still failing to recognize that many of the impacts come from land. Things like coastal development, land use change that often result in poor water quality and sedimentation, things that are driving seagrass loss. And I think in the context of marine protection, land use impacts have a far greater impact on the habitat that supports these fisheries than the fisheries themselves. If you had a water leak in your house that was ruining everything, you wouldn't begin mopping up before turning the water, turning off the water at the mains. It's important that we consider that it's not fisheries that are, in some cases it is, but it's not fisheries that are driving these widespread seagrass losses that are appearing across the Indo-Pacific. It is land use change. So in the context of that, I leave you all with a question to ponder over. With the millions of dollars that we're spending on things like seagrass restoration, would that money be better spent on restoring the land to allow seagrass to recover naturally and to continue to support the millions of people that depend on it? Yeah, with limited financial resources, where is that money better spent? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's something that we should consider, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. We see all sorts of conservation initiatives popping up and lots of conservation strategies trying to be adopted that often lack that wider systems thinking. And with that, I leave you with a bit of a more inspiring picture here. One of my most cherished moments, these two Monken children from remote Myanmar in the Meek archipelago that I mentioned earlier, that really have this wonderful connection to the ocean. They spend 6 months of the year at sea, and they have this wonderful connection to seagrass. And for me, I think it's for and because of these faces that conserving seagrass meadows is so important. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Definitely lots to think about. Your question about the restoration and money well spent. Yeah, so we'll open the floor to questions. Anybody has any questions for Ben? If you don't want to speak up, you can also put it in the chat. Maybe I will kick it off and ask you, Ben, about so why is it actually that seagrass fisheries have been ignored all over the world, despite the fact that it's so clearly important to so many communities?
I think there are probably various reasons for that. Even if if we just take a step back and think about the ecology of seagrass meadows and their role as habitats for fish, most of that earlier understanding of ocean environments and fish, it's particularly across reefs and other habitats, it's been driven by the use of underwater visual sensors. And what we know about seagrass meadows is that they are environments that provide habitat and shelter. So when someone snorkels over them in a black wetsuit or something, those fish are hiding. So I think part of that early narrative of seagrass meadows not being abundant in terms of fish are probably driven by the poor methods of actually characterizing those ecosystems. With the use of baited remote underwater video systems, we're seeing vast differences in the amount of fish that you're seeing in the same sorts of environments. But the other, I suppose, the other elephant in the room is just a naivety of of coral fisheries and even just think of the handbooks and the fact that these ID guides are called reef fish ID guides, but 30 to 40% of the fish that are in those ID guides utilize seagrass meadows. These have never been just reef fisheries. They've always been coastal fisheries. Whether we like it or not, I think it's just we've had blinkers on, and it's only with the kind of expansion of the seagrass research community that people are starting to see the role of those habitats. But the other side of that, with climate change and what's going on with reefs now, bleaching and mass degradation, there's no escaping what's happening. There's various sorts of papers that project what's going to happen, and the reality is that most of the world's reefs will not survive, and that has been happening. And I think many of those communities that might have been using reefs in the past are beginning to move inshore, whether it's due to stormy seas and just degradation. But there's all sorts of questions and answers that relate to that, I think.
Thanks. Richard, you've got a question?
Excellent talk, Ben. It's lovely to hear that whole story. It's pretty cool. Epic effort. And I just want to hear your thoughts on what you think about marine protected areas in this context, because I guess you refer to them in that seagrass spotter analysis. But last week we saw David Attenborough talking about almost playing the line that if we create 30% of our ocean as MPAs, then we'll save the ocean. Is that the answer?
I don't know. Depends, depends how much of these environments we protect. A lot of the world's biodiversity exists in the coastal zone. And if we're willing and wanting to protect that biodiversity, those MPAs need to be placed in those coastal zones, whether we agree with it or not. And I think the narratives around terrestrial protection, I think, are really useful to learn from. And there's, various papers that highlight all these hotspots of biodiversity that we need to protect to save the world's biodiversity. But they ignore the fact that most of those hotspots are on indigenous lands, where indigenous and local communities thrive and depend on that biodiversity. And I think it's the same message for both the land and sea, that we're ignoring the people that use those habitats. And if we don't think about those people, where they're going to turn to, then those MPAs are ultimately going to fail. People are still going to fish in them. And I think, some of the work done in the tropics around those community managed MPAs, where fishing is allowed, but in limited quantities and limited types of gears, they work. There's strong evidence to suggest that they are improving fish catches. So I think it really depends on what those MPAs are designed to do and set up to do. But as we know, for seagrass, I mean, the drivers aren't from the sea; they're from the land. So, those we need to solve that complexity there. We need to solve that issue of what's happening on land and how that's influencing those fishery habitats that we're intending to protect for fish. It's a complex question.
Yeah, fair answer. It's a difficult one to answer, but yeah.
Better minds than me have been pondering over these things for years, and we're still no closer to finding a solid answer.
Alex has a question. in the chat if we just wait for a bit. Or Alex, do you want to voice your question?
Pop your camera on
Yeah,
and
sure.
There you go.
Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm not going to be able to turn my camera on.
No problem. We can hear
But
you.
thanks so much, Ben. It was really insightful. Regarding, I guess, the question you asked back to us, and you touched on it a bit there. When we work with these locally managed areas that are working on ultimately restoring the fisheries and look towards land-based solutions, there's obviously a gap between the level in which the community can take ownership over their process. It's a lot easier for them to obviously manage their fisheries resources in some cases than maybe it is for them to stop coastal development happening. I'm just wondering if you have thought about any maybe practical steps communities might be able to take in order to kind of better govern their land almost to help improve the quality of seagrass. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
yeah. I mean, a strong example that we have is from work that Richard, Leanne, and myself did in the Wakatobi in Indonesia, where we worked well. A local NGO that we were assisting, they really devised this whole management scenario, but they were working with local landowners, farmers that had farms adjacent to riverbeds where river systems that had no trees left. And the strategy there was to work with those smallholder farmers to restore riparian vegetation, and ultimately improve the retention of water, reduce the sediments that are being driven into local seagrass meadows. But that's a unique case where those landowners have that possibility to do that. But I think it to really solve these issues that we do need to transform governance systems, and take bottom-up approaches, and it's not easy, and I think a lot of the messages that are set in the literature, in the media, assume that these things are easy, assume that they can be done, and I don't have an answer. There's few locations in the world where the coastal zone is even being even able to be leased to local communities to actually give them that right to manage it how they want. So yeah, hard question, and I don't really have a full-blown answer.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Thanks again for that, and also for the presentation.
No worries.
We've got a question for you in the chat from Elise. As you started mentioning coastal ecosystem connectivity, how can we take it into account when measuring the overall importance of each habitats for fisheries and fishing communities?
So, I mean, the simplest measure is to speak to them, and some of the work that I've been doing in Florida just shows the value of local knowledge, and there we've been developing a strategy to assess fishery changes over time, and just by asking simple questions like when was your best catch and when was your worst catch, we've managed to develop a 60-year trend in the status of a fishery that goes beyond any data set that exists at the government level. The data that we've generated correlates really strongly with the data that does exist in terms of fishery landings and things like that. So, I think the easiest strategy, and it's a sort of a win-win. You know, you're involving stakeholders in the whole process of management from start to end, is to ask them, where are they fishing most? Where do they see the most fish? Where do those fish come from? You know, these are individuals that spend all day, every day out at sea, trying to gain a livelihood, trying to feed their families, and they have such a wealth of information that I think it's really important to consider and do and integrate more social ecological systems thinking, integrate more social science into you know, marine ecology and fisheries ecology.
We've got time for more questions if anybody has any.
No problem, Elise. Thanks.
I think, yeah, okay. I think we might be out of questions if nobody else has any. Once again, please join me in thanking Ben for his presentation. And yes, you can watch this and share this again on YouTube. And please join us for future webinars. We will send out invites again when the next one is available and what that will be on. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers.